100 years ago. The Red Sox were baseball's most dominant franchise, with visions of a 5th championship in 16 seasons.
The Red Sox were coming off a dynastic stretch. They'd won the World Series in 1912, 1915, 1916.
But the United States was at war, and the immediate future of the game was in doubt.
The government decided that these baseball players were not going to be exempt from the work or fight rule. They were going to work or fight as soon as the season was over.
By season's end, there was little reason to celebrate, even in the home city of the world champions.
I refer to the 1918 World Series as maybe the most joyless World Series ever played.
Go back in time to 1918 on this edition of the Red Sox Report. 1918 was an important year in the history of the United States and an infamous one for the game of baseball.
The World War was first entered into by the United States in April 1917, and nobody really knew what was going to happen.
Over half of the players on the Red Sox from 1917 were gone by the time the 1918 season started. They were either enlisted or drafted or working in the war industry in some way.
In fact, Van Johnson, the president of the American League, had actually offered to shut down baseball at that time, but President Woodrow Wilson said, no, you know, people need their recreation, they need their diversion, so baseball continued.
The Red Sox owner, Harry Frazee, firmly believed that the war would be over by opening day of 1918. So he went on a buying spree in the offseason. He just bought players from the Philadelphia A's for $60,000.
A pitcher by the name of Bullet Joe Bush, a catcher by the name of Wally Shang, and an outfielder named Amos Strunk. And he later made another deal with the Athletics for a first baseman from Gloucester, Massachusetts, Jack Stuffy McInnes. So Frazee thought he had to do things to put people in the seats, and was confident that the Red Sox would have a winning ball club.
But he was convinced and very publicly bet 6-to-1 odds that the war would be over by opening day. He lost.
The 1918 Red Sox season began as usual, but it wasn't long before the war affected rosters across the league.
In May, the government issued what became known as the work or fight rule. And that said that every man in America between the ages of 21 and 30 had to either enlist, make themselves eligible for the draft, or get a job that directly supported the war effort. That left baseball in kind of a tough spot. Theater workers, actors, were exempt because the government decided that that was good for morale, for the citizens to have something to distract them from the war effort. And the question was, did baseball fall into that category as entertainment and a morale booster? Or were baseball players not exempt from this work or fight rule? It was due to take effect on July 1st, and baseball was in a crisis. They didn't know if they were going to be able to continue to play, if the government was going to shut them down, if they were all going to get drafted.
Red Sox pitcher Dutch Leonard wasn't going to wait around. So Leonard, who had pitched a no-hitter that season, he enlists into the Navy and is in another shipyard here in the Boston area. Every
big industry had baseball teams. There were industrial leagues all around the country. And it was a way to avoid getting drafted, still get paid, and be technically okay with the government, but continue to play baseball.
With players leaving the team early in the season, ownership began to panic. Red Sox manager Ed Barrow's roster was short on pitching and power.
Because the Sox had lost so many players to the war, an unusual opportunity presented itself for maybe the marquee player on the Red Sox roster at the time.
Though many players had left the Red Sox during the 1918 season due to the World War, a star remained. He saw a mighty opportunity for himself with the openings on the roster. an opportunity that led to conflict within the clubhouse.
They had a 23-year-old left-handed pitcher by the name of Babe Ruth, who the previous season had won 24 games.
Earned run average that I recall is 2.01. You can't get much better than that. He had 2 home runs all year long in 1917. He was not the slugger yet.
He had been battling back and forth with manager Ed Barrow. He wanted to hit. He didn't want to just play every 4th day. Everybody wanted Ruth to be in the lineup every day because not only was he one of the best pitchers in baseball, he was the best hitter in all of baseball. Barrow wasn't having it. He decided that if he let his best pitcher hit, he said, I'll be the laughingstock of baseball. But, as Hooper pointed out to him, do you really want Babe Ruth with nothing to do 4 out of 5 days? He just was not capable of staying out of trouble. So finally in early May, Barrow gave in and put Ruth in the lineup.
May 6, Polo Grounds against the Yankees. Babe, of course, hits a home run. As the story goes, Jacob Rupert, the owner of the Yankees, turned to Frazee and on the spot offered him $100,000 for the Babe. I think in literature we call that foreshadowing. 3 days later, Babe goes 5 for 5. Goes off on a 10-game hitting streak.
At the time, the American League record for home runs in a season was 16. By the end of June, Ruth had 10. And it was clear that Barrow was not going to be a laughingstock for having his pitcher hit. Well, Ruth got so enamored of being a hitter that he was constantly finding excuses not to pitch. Kept saying his wrist hurt, not so much that he couldn't hit, but so much that he couldn't pitch. Barrow was anxious to get him back into the rotation because without Ruth, he was down to 3 starting pitchers. He had a 3-man rotation.
Barrow's level of annoyance with the Babe is increasing over this time.
He'd already been giving Barrow some hard times by coming in, I would say late at night, but it was actually early in the morning or even late in the morning, like maybe 4 a.m.
Finally comes to a head in Washington on July 2nd. Tells Babe, before he goes up to bat the first time, take a few pitches. Babe swings at the first pitch.
And Barrow just blew up. Ruth threatened to punch Barrow in the nose, and immediately Barrow said, that's a $500 fine. And Ruth said, really? Took off his uniform and watched the rest of the game from the stands.
Reporters find him that night in his father's bar in Baltimore. So he comes back the next day, and then Babe shocks them all by announcing that he has taken a job at the Chester Shipyards in Baltimore, and he's going to pitch for the Shipyard team. Well, now, you know, Boston people are in a panic.
But Ruth being Ruth, he got over it, he calmed down, and a couple of days later kind of sheepishly came back to the club. But that tension continued between Barrow and Ruth all the way through to the World Series. With Ruth really wanting to be a full-time hitter, Barrow really wanting him to be a full-time pitcher.
With the war's work or fight rule in place, Major League Baseball and the federal government had to make a decision. How long would the 1918 season continue?
The compromise that was struck with the Secretary of War, Newton Baker, was that the World Series could go until September 15. So the season essentially ended at the very beginning of September, which was highly unusual, of course.
The Red Sox were never out of first place all season long. They were either in first place or tied for first throughout the entire 1918 season.
The Red Sox finished the 1918 season with a record of 75-51. They were set to play the 84-45 Cubs in the World Series, with games 1 through 3 scheduled for Chicago.
And the expectation was that Barrow was going to take off the raps on Babe and that he would play every day. Well, Babe pitches the first game and wins, shutout, 1-0. Next 2 games, the assumption is, okay, Babe's bat's going to make a difference. Barrow does not play the Babe, ostensibly because the Cubs used left-handed pitchers in games 2 and 3.
The Cubs used a 2-man rotation, and they were both left-handed starters because the Red Sox had a very left-handed heavy lineup.
The Babe was an equal opportunity masher. He hit lefties just almost as well as he hit righties.
He wanted to be out there playing, but Barrow insisted. that against those left-handed pitchers, he was not going to use Ruth, which seems amazing today, that you would have Babe Ruth and you'd leave him on the bench.
I mean, it got to the point of ludicrousness. The Sox are down 3-1 with 2 runners on in the 9th inning. Babe's essentially holding the bat in his hands, assuming he's going to get a call to pinch hit. There's only 1 out. And Barrow passes over him not once, but twice, leaves him on the bench. Doesn't play again in Game 3, which the Sox win, so they're up 2-1 going back to Boston.
With the war at a crucial stage, World Series attendance was down significantly. The historically low numbers began to affect the games in more ways than one.
The players at the beginning of the series in Chicago had received written information from the National Commission that outlined exactly how they were going to get paid for the World Series. And it was different than it had been in the past. For the first time ever, they decided that the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th place teams in each league were also going to get a share of World Series revenue. But the players didn't pay much attention to the paperwork that they got from the commission. During the war, most of what we would now consider to be baseball's target audience was either in the military or working in a war-related job. There was no disposable income. There was no time off to go to an afternoon baseball game.
Attendance was down pretty dramatically, so the word was that the players weren't going to be making as much money as they would have just the year before.
So the Cubs played their home games at Comiskey Park because it was bigger than Weigman Field, which later became Wrigley Field, and they figured they were going to need those seats. Well, they didn't sell out any of those games. The Red Sox sort of went the opposite way. In 1915 and 1916, they had played their World Series games at Braves Field. But in 1918, they decided to play here at Fenway Park. But the commissioners panicked. They dropped prices to regular season prices. So now players were faced with low attendance at lower ticket prices, and they were sharing gate revenues with the top 4 finishers in each league.
After Game 3, a train ride from Chicago to Boston added to the drama.
After the first 3 games in Chicago, the teams headed back to Boston.
The first 3 games would be played in Chicago, and then any other games that were necessary would be played in Boston.
Now, typically teams would have taken separate trains, but the war was on, and they decided to take a single train to save money, to save fuel. Well, that was unusual.
Maybe the umpires were on there too, and certainly the newspaper people were on there for sure.
The Sox had a guy, college-educated outfielder by the name of Harry Hooper. He had been paying close attention to what baseball intended to pay these guys. It was going to be a 55-45 split of the gate receipts for the first 4 games.
At one point, it looked like the winners were going to get less than $1,000. They believed that they were going to get $2,000 minimum.
They began a discussion as to whether they should hold out, in effect, before Game 4 until they were guaranteed at least some kind of minimum.
And Harry Hooper for the Red Sox and a guy by the name of Les Mann for the Cubs decided they were going to go to Van Johnson and Herman of the Reds and the National Commission and say, hey, look, we got to make a different arrangement here.
And they tried to see the owners at the Copley Square Hotel. The owners didn't show up.
So now the players are really hot, and there's some question as to whether they're even going to take the field.
Leading into Game 4 of the 1918 World Series, tensions were high. Conflicts and all, the game went on as scheduled.
Babe takes the hill in Game 4. Now, players on both sides are not very happy about where things are going here. Babe's scuffling, but he gets through it. So the Sox win that game. Now they're up now 3-1.
And then after Game 4, the owners wouldn't meet with them.
I told them we're not all here right now. We'll get together and talk about it tomorrow. Just play the next game.
So Game 5 is when things really boiled over. Red Sox players, Cubs players all met together and decided, unless something changed, unless they were going to get more than it seemed they were going to get, they weren't going to play.
I mean, essentially, the players had gone on strike.
Before Game 5, the National Commission finally met with the players, delaying the start of the game.
They met in a little tiny umpire's room beneath the stands, and the three-man National Commission showed up, and 2 out of the 3 were so drunk they could barely stand up. Harry Hooper tried to talk to them, and they were blubbery and weepy and incoherent. And in frustration, Hooper turned to the press, who were also crammed into the room, and said, "There's nobody here we can talk to. There's nobody here who can talk." The 2 teams went to one of the locker rooms to talk it over. And that's when Hooper made a very interesting point to them. He said, if the Red Sox win today, the series is over, and we'll have no more opportunity to argue with the owners about how much we're going to get paid. And lo and behold, the Red Sox lost.
They get shut out. There really was a sense that teams had gone through the motions in this game.
Game 6 was overshadowed by the tension. Fans lost interest. Players lost interest. The joy of the World Series was gone.
There were 24,000 people here for Game 5, 15,000 people here for Game 6. Sentiment was not with the players in the public. Here were guys who were getting paid to play a game, while everybody else between the ages of 21 and 30 were either getting drafted or enlisting or working in the war effort. The Red Sox had their World Series team picture taken before the game. The Cubs kind of went through the motions in Game 6. They realized they weren't going to get their money. And the Red Sox won the game, but it was as anticlimactic as a game could be.
No celebration in the stands. No celebration on the field. It was almost as if everyone was happy just to get it over with.
Game ended, players walked off the field, the fans went home. Little did they know there would be another 86 years before they'd win a World Series, and even more than that before they'd win a World Series here at Fenway Park.
Though the 1918 World Series was bleak, it carries not only a lasting legacy, but also some intriguing stories.
There has been this theory that the Cubs threw the World Series in 1918. And there's some pretty compelling evidence that at least one player may have been doing what he could to see that the Cubs did not win. Max Flack was a very talented right fielder for them, but he did not have a good series.
In Game 4, Max did something that has never been duplicated before or after. He got picked off twice in the same game.
And then in that same game, Ruth came to the plate, and the Cubs pitcher turned to Flack in right field and told him to back up. And Flack ignored him, and Ruth promptly tripled over his head. There were some questionable things going on with him. But this was a guy who had a reputation for being a smart, heady ball player. I suppose it could just be that he had a bad series. But boy, did he have a bad series.
The 1918 World Series started a long-standing tradition in sports as well.
At Comiskey Park, in Game 1 of the World Series, in the middle of the seventh inning stretch, the band struck up the Star-Spangled Banner. It was not common for the Star-Spangled Banner to be played at baseball games. There were no public address systems in stadiums back then, and it was only on rare occasions that there was a band.
The Red Sox had a third baseman named Fred Thomas, who had gone into the Navy. Well, he'd missed most of the season, but he was permitted to join the Red Sox for the World Series. Well, Thomas immediately snaps to attention, saluting the flag. The players on the field, players in front of the other dugout, also stand at attention. At the conclusion of the anthem, an enormous roar through the crowd.
This was a new phenomenon. Patriotic fervor was high during the war, so the Cubs did it for Game 2 and 3, and the Red Sox did it for Games 4, 5, and 6. But after 1918, it became a tradition to play it at every World Series game. It wasn't until World War II and the advent of public address systems that it became tradition to play it at every game before the game.
It caught on, and from that point on, up for obviously more than 100 years now, we have the national anthem played at most sporting events.
In 1918, the Red Sox were the elite team in baseball. No fan knew then that the dynasty had reached its end.
At the time the Red Sox won the World Series in 1918, they were by far the most dominant team in all of baseball. They'd won the World Series in 1912 and 1915 and 1916, and now in 1918, they were a dynasty. And it all came to an end. And the story turned to one of frustration and what could have been and what it almost was.
It was striking how the Red Sox had gone from being baseball's first true dynasty, or it's certainly the first true dynasty of the 20th century, to a team that was on the ropes. I mean, think about it. This was the 5th time in 16 seasons that the Red Sox had won a World Series. 1903, 12, 15, 16, 18. It never occurred to anybody that it would be 86 years before the Red Sox would win another World Series.
And over time, that legend grows, and it becomes this iconic season that, yes, Yankee fans will use against Red Sox fans for generations.
So it was all this sing-song thing, 1918, 1918.
1918 was the cross that Red Sox fans had to bear for decades. I mean, there wasn't anything that probably was more insulting to a Sox fan than to hear the damn Yankee fans chanting 1918 anytime the Red Sox were on the brink of another defeat.
And so it was a taunt. It was like, you haven't won it since 1918. You haven't won it for 75 years or 80 years, whatever it was at the time, because this chant went on for quite some time.
We probably didn't remember it as the year that World War I ended, but it was seared in the memory of all Red Sox fans as the last time the Red Sox won a World Series.
And so, the legacy of the 1918 World Series was created.
Between the work stoppage, the complaining about the money, the rumors of gambling, the blatant ineptness of some of the play, which reinforced the suspicions of gambling, it was a joyless event.
And the future of baseball was very much in doubt, because it was clear to everybody involved that baseball was shutting down for as long as the war was going to go on. They were not going to come back the next spring. Baseball was out of business until the war was over. Now, it turned out the war was over 6 weeks later, but they didn't know that at the time. So it was as dreary a World Series victory as you could imagine.
And with that dreary end, the Red Sox clock began ticking. It would be 86 years before they'd win another World Series championship, and another 95 before celebrating again at historic Fenway Park.